Failure is a very real possibility, and individual failures can have far-reaching effects when you're at the top of an organisation. How do you deal with failure?
I'm not very good at dealing with failure, so I try and make sure I succeed. However, I think it is about recognizing one's humanness. I think that I try and make sure and share with my staff that there are times that I might disappoint them. I will do my best at all times, but even my best as their best might not always work out. So I think it's really about recognizing to work with my strengths, acknowledging my weaknesses, and finding the best people around me who can upskill my weaknesses and so that I can be the best I can be with my strengths. I think that's really the best way to mitigate failure. Work with what you know and acknowledge what you don't.
It's tough. The first thing I'd say, there was a great line from a Macquarie chief executive that anchored an off-site Macquarie Bank conference, and it was around trying to learn from what we hadn't done well, and his line was, we fail our way to success. And this idea that we fail our way to success, I think, is a really powerful concept, that unless we're prepared to experiment, take risks, learn from what we don't do well and move forward from that, we're not pushing the envelope. So failure as an inevitable consequence of testing the organisation, testing leadership, growing, developing, I think is profoundly important. How you deal with it is very important. My view is, as CEO and leader, you've got to bring a game face to the office and to the team, which is one of relentless but practical optimism. And the times when I've not done that, I've learnt that's a really bad mistake. And I remember vividly an early lesson, and we had a very bright intern who didn't mind expressing a pretty blunt view, and in the early days funding was critical, and we'd had a funding application in that I was certain we were going to get. And I remember it was a small open plan office. There were only about, I think, 10 or 11 of us working at SVA. And I got a letter which said, we haven't got this funding. And my response when I opened this letter was A, to swear, B, there's a little kind of black cloud hovering over my head. And that was pretty visible. And I, after about 2 or 3 hours, I got this email that clicked up from this woman that said, you need to be conscious that your black moods cast a shadow over the whole office. And it was good advice, and it was a big lesson, which was, that sort of stuff happens, shit happens. That's a fail. But the dumbest thing you can do is process your response to that in a setting in public. By all means, process it offline, offsite, at home, with mentors, coaches, but don't bring that into a space where it damages the morale of the team. As my friend and co-coach Chris Cuff says, as soon as you walk out of the lift into the office, put on your game face. And if you can't do that, you're better off not being there. And I think that's actually pretty good advice.
I've thought about this question about failure a lot, actually, because when I look back, I'm not conscious of a lot of, personal failures that I've had, but of course something I read recently has really stuck with me, which was that you can't really assess a CEO's performance until about 10 years after they've left the role. So there may be a trail of failures behind me for all I know, but the decisions that you make today, as you say, their ramifications will only be known over time. But I've also seen colleagues sometimes paralysed by that, that anxiety and that fear. And I guess I'm quite pragmatic sometimes. You have to, I think, make the best decision that you can at the time, and sometimes you have to go with good enough. And that's hard for me to say because I'm a perfectionist, but I have learned that sometimes you have to go with good enough because your people are there, your people are waiting for you, they need a decision, and you just make the best one you can.
Look, I think first of all you need to understand what's the appetite, the risk appetite for your organisation. I mean, my view is if you don't take risk, you're not going to achieve greatness. So if you take risk, you're going to fail. So you need to build a culture that it's actually acceptable to fail, but you need to learn from every single time where you failed. And you need to use that as a learning journey for you and your team. and also developing a learning culture about taking risk. An example, we launched a couple of years ago, we needed to diversify our income stream and we wanted to test a digital channel. We launched a program called Move Movement. It didn't take off, but we learned a huge amount from it. So this year, 2.5 years later, we've decided that we need to continue to invest in the digital space. But this time we've incorporated a lot of the learnings from the first program. And so we've got more chance to be successful, but to be honest, until you try it again and look at your benchmark for the next 6 months, we won't know whether we really are greatly successful, mildly successful, or it doesn't work.
Relationships and communication are really important as well, because the more that you have engagement around strategy, the more people help and support you. And I think it's a massive risk not to have that engagement.
I think we have a culture here in Australia that failure is particularly bad, but I actually think if you use it as a learning experience, it's actually quite valuable. And obviously as an organisation, we don't put the organisation in any great risk. So, the failures are calculated in terms of the risks that we take within the organisation. But I think we try and encourage, a culture of calculated risk. So we're not afraid of, if something doesn't work, that's okay. It's not going to damage the organisation. But at the same time, we can learn off that if it doesn't work.
You need to learn from your failure. You need to develop a good sense of humility. I think it's very important. Egos are often obstructing organization to go forward. And when I say egos, it means that when people fail, they hide it, they're not disclosing it, they're not learning from it, and the fear culture, it suddenly takes precedent in the whole entire organization. So if people see that you're failing and you're open to disclose it and you explain the reason and the context around your failure and you allow them then to fail as well and to take risk, you're more likely in the long term to have an organization that is kicking greater goals than if everyone is fearful of making the wrong move. And I think, in terms of critical failure, I think you've got to take responsibility for it.